Good evening, everyone. My name is Bethy Atkins. On behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'd like to welcome you to the Cambridge Public Library. Tonight, I'm extremely pleased to have Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt with us to discuss their book, How Democracies Die. I'd like to thank our hosts for tonight's event, the Cambridge Public Library. Please check out more upcoming library programming and be sure to join their email list to learn all about their event series. And for more information on Harvard Bookstore's event series, please visit us online at harvard.com/events. I'd also like to thank tonight's co-sponsor, Mass Humanities. Mass Humanities supports programs that use history, literature, philosophy, and the other disciplines to enhance and improve civic life for the people of Massachusetts. Learn more at masshumanities.org. Tonight's talk will conclude with time for your questions. Please note that this talk is being recorded by C-SPAN, and during Q&A, your questions will be recorded. To ask a question, please come to the mic at the front of this aisle to my left. Following Q&A, there will be a book signing here on stage. The signing line will form down the aisle to my right, the end of which may extend out into the hallway, and the line will come onto the stage and exit out the door to my right. Books can be purchased at the book table outside the lecture hall, and How Democracies Die is 20% off tonight. Thank you for making purchases from Harvard Bookstore. In doing so, you're helping to support an independent bookstore and ensuring the future of this author series. And just a reminder, we ask you to please turn off or silence your cell phones. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt are professors of government at Harvard University. Professor Levitsky's research focuses on Latin America and the developing world, and he's the author of Competitive Authoritarianism. Professor Ziblatt studies Europe from the 19th century to the present, and he's the author most recently of Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy. In her recent New York Times review of their book, How Democracies Die, Jennifer Salai notes that Levitsky and Ziblatt show how democracies have collapsed elsewhere, not just through violent coups, but more commonly and insidiously through a gradual slide into authoritarianism, and praises that How Democracies Die is a lucid and essential guide to what can happen here. Please join me in welcoming Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt.
Hello, everyone. It's really wonderful to be here and to see such a big crowd. Thank you to the Harvard Bookstore, Mass Humanities, and also to the Cambridge Public Library. I can't think of a more appropriate place to discuss the current state of our democracy than in a free public library. So it's really great to be here. So Steve and I are going to kind of tag team tonight. I'm going to start off and then hand things over to Steve. And what we're going to do tonight is talk about the motivation behind our book and some of the things we've learned while working on this book. So I want to begin really first just by talking about the motivations that led to this project. So we both teach in the Harvard Government Department. We're colleagues. We've taught together and researched together for 15 years. We study democracy in crisis and authoritarianism in other parts of the world. This is what we've spent our careers doing. But we were motivated to write this book because Steve and I, like many of you perhaps, watched the 2015-2016 presidential election, first with a kind of sense of uneasiness, growing disbelief, and eventually shock at the tenor of political debate. But since we have spent our careers studying democracies in crisis in other countries, me in Europe and in the 19th and 20th century, Steve in Latin America, the 1960s to the present, there was another layer of trepidation. At first, it was really just small echoes. You know, we saw during the presidential election the Republican nominee rail against the media, threaten to not accept the results of elections, accuse his political rival of being a criminal, threatening to lock up his former rival if elected, and finally condoning violence at political rallies. So many people thought these were just words, you know, in some sense they were, but Steve and I were both increasingly nervous because we recognized that these were really hallmarks, these four things that happened during the presidential election, going after the media, talking about elections in this way, criticizing a rival in this way, condoning violence. These were hallmarks of authoritarians in other countries. And moreover, no major presidential party candidate in the United States, in at least the 20th century, but even longer, had ever done any of these things, had ever behaved this way. But many candidates we recognized for political office in other countries who eventually became authoritarian leaders had behaved this way. So both of us had this uncanny feeling that we had seen this movie before, elsewhere, and it rarely ends well. So we decided we had to write this book. We wanted to draw upon the knowledge we have of other countries and other experiences to look at democracies that have confronted crises and then overcome these crises, and other places where countries have confronted these kinds of crises and succumbed to these crises, to draw lessons from these experiences, to try to understand our own country's predicament. So while working on the book, we came to some conclusions that differ, I think, from how many today think about the Trump presidency. We came to realize that the problem facing our political system today is not just Donald Trump alone. It's not just his outrageous comments, his confusing or unusual psychology. It's tempting to focus on the most outrageous latest tweet or political gossip. But at some level, we realized this is a distraction. It's important to keep your eye on the ball. At the end of the day, we came to realize, as we worked on this book, that Donald Trump was not just a cause of our political system's problems. He was in many ways a symptom. He was a symptom of deeper underlying problems in our political system. We realize, in short, that the problem runs deeper than Trump. So tonight, what we're going to do is talk about three discoveries we made in the process of writing our book that led us to this conclusion that the problem runs deeper than Trump. I'm going to first start off by talking about the first discovery. Steve will talk about the second and third. Okay, so discovery number one. The best way to stop authoritarians is to prevent them from coming to power in the first place. Okay, what does this mean? Well, in the context of the United States, this means that we have to pay attention to not just why Donald Trump was elected, but also how he ever came to be the nominee of a major political party in the first place. So let me elaborate. In the Cold War, 3/4 of democratic breakdowns around the world happened at the hands of men with guns in the form of military coups. Since the collapse of communism, the world has changed, and most democratic breakdowns arrive at the ballot box through elections. Demagogues come to power through elections, and once in power, they inflict serious damage on democratic political institutions. So really a grave paradox facing democracies today is how does a democracy prevent an autocratic-minded demagogue from coming into power and then dismantling those democratic institutions that brought him into power in the first place? Now, throughout American history, we've happily avoided this paradox. But it was not because there were no demagogues, and it's not because there weren't voters who might support demagogues. In fact, we really have a tendency, I think, to whitewash our own history and to forget there's really a continuous strand in American history of authoritarians who gain around 30% approval in opinion surveys. So this strand runs from Henry Ford in the 1920s, the founder of Ford Motor Company, who was a famous anti-Semite, who was cited positively in Mein Kampf, who considered running for president in the 1920s. Huey Long in the 1930s, Joe McCarthy in the 1950s, George Wallace in the 1960s. Gallup poll data really going back to the 1930s shows that each of these figures consistently garnered around 30% approval ratings in public opinion surveys. And this is a number that really runs to today's support, 35% approval for our president. So I don't think it's actually too much to say that there's really a continuous, perhaps latent strand of authoritarianism running as a subcurrent in American political culture. In some ways, the United States is not unique. This probably applies to most countries. But here's really the point. None of these figures I just cited, Ford, Long, Wallace, none of these figures ever made it close to the presidency. Though they were popular, they were kept far from power. So how and what changed in 2016? So in the book, we emphasize two contributing factors, and I'm just going to kind of lay them out more schematically here. We lay this out in more detail, of course, in the book. What changed? First, the way we pick our presidents has changed. Until 1972, and for the first 3/4 of the 20th century, presidential candidates were selected by party leaders in a kind of system of gatekeeping, or what political scientists sometimes have called peer review, where political party leaders who worked up close with the candidates got together and selected the candidates. These were politicians who would get together and This was criticized, of course, as the kind of smoke-filled back room, but these politicians had a big say in picking candidates. And so what this meant was that voters essentially were irrelevant at the stage of picking candidates. It was party leaders who picked candidates. Voters, of course, mattered in the general election, but it was party leaders who picked candidates. Now the system, the smoke-filled back room, certainly had downsides. It was exclusive, it wasn't very democratic, sometimes generated mediocre candidates. If you know anything about Warren G. Harding, he's a kind of prototype of somebody who emerged out of the smoke-filled room who was maybe mediocre. But all systems have advantages and disadvantages. And the advantage of this system was that it worked well, in fact perfectly, in keeping extremists from ever becoming viable candidates for president. It was a screening system, a filtration system, a gatekeeping system that effectively kept demagogues out. Now, we all know that the American political system and American society changed dramatically in 1968, a tragic year of 1968. The way we select our candidates also changed in 1968. The presidential system was opened up. The smoke-filled rooms were opened up. Primaries were made binding. Voters could now select the candidates for office. The general election was now preceded by the nearly continuous primary season that we all know that goes on for months and months and months, where the voters had a say in picking the candidates. Now, this certainly was a more open system, but it's interesting that there were two political scientists who wrote in the early 70s who warned that the fall of this filtration system could also open the door to demagogues. Now, to be clear, we don't advocate going back to that old system. But at the same time, we have to recognize that the current system is double-edged. It is more open, and so what this means is that if a demagogue ever runs for office, the road to nomination is much clearer. Now, it's also true that in the 1980s, the Democratic Party introduced a system of superdelegates, where elected officials held extra sway in the selection of candidates. This kind of contained some elements of the old system, creating a kind of more complicated obstacle course on the way to the nomination. But Republicans never adopted this system. They never adopted superdelegates. So the door was much more open. So this meant that if a demagogue ever decided to run for president, especially in the Republican Party, there was a much more open road to gain the nomination. And this is exactly what happened in 2016. Donald Trump, a modern-day demagogue, became the nominee of the Republican Party. So there's a second factor, though, that we also emphasize in the book, that prevents someone from that shapes whether someone with authoritarian tendencies can reach this kind of position of power to be a nominee and come into office. And in many ways, this second factor is the thing that we emphasize more and is more crucial in many ways. Because after all, Donald Trump won the nomination, but this didn't mean he was necessarily going to become president. I mean, first of all, Hillary Clinton could have beat him. But the second point that we emphasize in the book, just as importantly, was that it was absolutely imperative for the Republican Party to play a role here. There was an imperative role for Republican Party allies of Donald Trump to play. And so here's really the central pivot of the story. Authoritarians come to power electoral authoritarians come to power not just via elections, but also with the enabling aid of establishment party allies. So throughout history, this repeats itself. Italy in the 1920s, Germany in the 1930s, Venezuela in the 1990s. This is really a crucial test. When a demagogue comes along who clearly violates democratic norms and gets close to power, one of the last off-ramps that determines is whether or not establishment politicians, party allies, finally break with the demagogue, with the autocrat and the Mickey. Do they draw a line in the sand and say, beyond this we will not go? Or do they abdicate? Do they overlook the violations? Do they let party trump their commitment to democratic norms? And in effect, do they form a Faustian bargain, allowing their ideological ally, but an autocrat in the making, into power? Do they enable the authoritarian? Because when elected authoritarians get to power in this last stage, it's nearly always because mainstream politicians, out of miscalculation or opportunism, let them in the door. The enabling role of the Republican Party is actually not unique. This happens remarkably often. In Venezuela in the 1990s, Hugo Chavez got his political start by being given a big boost from a long-time mainstream fixture of Venezuelan politics, President Rafael Caldera, who freed Chavez from jail, gave Chavez a boost in legitimacy, and Caldera was hoping to kind of tap into some of the energy around Chavez. Caldera was an older politician. His time had passed, and within several years, Chavez was president. Caldera was long gone. An even better example is Italy in the 1920s, the early 1920s. Benito Mussolini was a complete outcast of the mainstream. But a long-standing prominent liberal politician, Giovanni Giletti, saw Mussolini on the horizon and decided to include him on his party list in the early 20s to tap into some of the energy on the far right. Within a year, Giletti was long gone. Mussolini was prime minister. In Weimar, Germany, a similar story unfolded. The leader of the German Conservative Party, kind of the head of a kind of very elitist, aristocratic party, without a popular base, allied himself with Hitler in the late 20s, issued joint party programs, held rallies together, trying to draw on Hitler's grassroots appeal to try to shore up this relatively elitist party. But this backfired. The conservatives disintegrated. Hitler grew in prominence. By January 1933, he was in power. In this fateful moment in January 1933, when Hitler was named chancellor, Franz von Papen, who was a leading statesman at the time, assured his conservative allies, "Don't worry." This is a quote. "Within 2 months, we'll have him into a corner, and he'll squeal." In every instance, the mainstream or the establishment politicians open the door, abdicate, fail in their gatekeeping function, and out of miscalculation or opportunism, let the extremist in the door. In every instance, the mainstream politicians make the same mistake. They kind of form this Faustian bargain, thinking they can contain the outsider. In every instance, the Faustian bargain backfires. So the same thing happened in the United States in 2016. Republicans enabled Donald Trump. Many leading Republicans, even after candidate Trump won the nomination, who openly despised Trump and were offended by Trump, could have crossed party lines. They could have, but didn't, for example, endorse Hillary Clinton. They could have put democracy ahead of country, ahead of party. This could have made a difference. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, well, how realistic is that? Could that really happen? Would have politicians really done this? Well, it turns out we don't have to look very far to find evidence that this is possible. If you look to the 2017 French presidential election, the conservative Republican Party candidate in that country, François Fillon, didn't make it to the second round. It's a 2-round election system. Didn't make it to the second round. In the second round, the question is, would he endorse Marine Le Pen, the populist demagogue, or would he support Macron, who had been a minister in the former socialist government? Although he was ideologically maybe closer to Le Pen, he endorsed Macron. In the United States, the Republicans did not do this. They let our Le Pen in the door. Donald Trump was elected president, and once an authoritarian is in the door, it's a changed game. So Steve's going to tell us how this ended.
So will our Constitution save us? Thank you, by the way, for coming. I have to calm down. I got feedback from my wife after we gave a talk in Brookline last week, and she said, "Stop pounding repeatedly on the lectern." She said, "You're not Nikita Khrushchev." So I'm going to try to, I get a little worked up. Will our Constitution save us? Our second discovery is not necessarily. Americans have a lot of faith in our constitutional system of checks and balances, and for good reason. We have the oldest, we have the most successful Constitution in the history of the world. Our system of checks and balances contained Andrew Jackson, it contained FDR, it contained Nixon. Why shouldn't it contain Trump? But constitutions don't just work automatically. If they did, Argentina, which adopted a constitution which was basically an exact replica of ours in the 19th century, would have been a stable democracy in the 20th century. Instead, it had 6 military coups. Constitutions work best, constitutions work well, when they're reinforced by robust democratic norms or unwritten rules. And our book focuses on 2 norms in particular. One is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of our partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we disagree with our opponents, no matter how much we may dislike our opponents. We recognize both privately and publicly that they are loyal citizens who love their country, who respect the Constitution, and importantly, who have an equal and legitimate right to compete for power and to govern. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. The second norm is what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of self-restraint. It is the underutilization of power. We don't think about forbearance a lot in politics, but it is absolutely essential. Think about what the president is constitutionally able to do in this country. The president can pardon whoever he or she wants, whenever she wants. Any president with a congressional majority can pack the Supreme Court. If you don't like the way the Supreme Court is ruling, you can expand it. If you have a majority in Congress, pass a law, expand it to 11, expand it to 13, and fill the new seats with partisan allies. Perfectly legal. Or if a president's agenda is stalled in Congress, the president can circumvent the legislative process and make policy through executive proclamations or executive orders. The Constitution does not explicitly prohibit such behavior. Or think about what Congress can do. The Senate can use its right of advice and consent to block all the president's cabinet picks, all of his or her court picks, can prevent the president from filling Supreme Court vacancies. Congress can refuse to fund the government. It can effectively shut down the government. And of course, Congress can impeach the president on virtually whatever grounds it chooses.